If you drive through Alberta long enough, and it won't take long, you're bound to see an oil well. Some look just like you'd expect, the pump jack moving up and down. Others don't. But across the province, there are more than 450,000 wells dotting the landscape. Most, if not all of these that are operating, are controlled by some kind of computer, monitoring their activity, downtime, and efficiency. And as it happens, they're not all using the same kind of computer. They have different computers running different systems, churning out different kinds of data. And those wells are often changing hands, being bought and sold, and rebought and resold. So one company might own a handful of wells, each controlled by a different system, running different software, sending out, you guessed it, different data. You can't see all of this from the highway, but it's happening. Different data streams clashing and intersecting as the pump jack goes up and down. But if you could wrangle all of that data, if you could get it all going to the same place and make sense of it all, you could really change how these wells operate. You could apply artificial intelligence to make the wells more efficient and to reduce emissions. And then you could apply that same technology to other energy sources, like say wind turbines, and make them work even better too. That is what Ambyint is trying to do. So we sat down with their CEO, Benjamin Kemp, to discuss the role of artificial intelligence in lowering costs and reducing emissions across our energy industry. Here on Carbon Copy. Well, thanks for joining us today, Benjamin. I'm really excited to learn more about Ambyint. So let's start there. What is Ambyint, and what is the solution that your team has developed?
Absolutely. Happy to walk you through that. Over the years, Ambyint has really become a formidable organization focused on what we now phrase as physics-influenced artificial intelligence. So what does that really mean? We help companies at scale in the traditional oil and gas sector, onshore, not offshore, but onshore, optimize wells. And by doing that, we actually help them optimize their overall production side of the house. And we've been doing that with a number of customers, both in Canada and in the US. We have done some work internationally as well. And what's really come to light is three things. The reason the customers engage with us is it's a complex problem, and one that, quite frankly, as a well goes through its decline curve, as you can appreciate, wells over time, they start out performing beautifully, but over time, through complexities and age, they start to decline and become more costly to service and maintain. So therefore, they get less attention from an organization. That we're able to come in and really keep an eye on those wells for customers all the time. And they're just not able to get to that. So there's sort of the visibility to the well, but in doing that, by creating greater visibility, they get greater performance. And performance comes twofold, i.e. can you keep the production above the decline curve, which we do for customers, and can you help us with things like anomaly detection and predictive maintenance of that well, which is the cost side of the equation. So that's sort of one bucket, and then ERA engaged with us, and it became quite prevalent that we're having a significant impact also on the overall environmental impact of that well, i.e. the more that well is managed and maintained and optimized, the less the impact it does have environmentally. And so that's become a conversation that was sort of early on supported by ERA, but really has driven into the marketplace much more prevalence than we originally thought. And so it's a larger topic of conversation for us these days.
Well, thanks very much. So help me understand the technology, maybe just a little bit better. You've got this physics-based artificial intelligence solution, if I got that correctly, and you've got conventional oil and gas wells. What's the connection there? How does that get applied at the wells, and what is being optimized?
Yeah, quite simply, we have, and this has been a change since ERA would have, sort of been involved with Ambyint initially, our offering is twofold. It is effectively, we need to get access to lots of data. As you can appreciate, if you're going to start to get into optimizing a well that's highly complex and not easy to understand, you need lots of data to do that. So first off, we need to source the data, and we do that through two methods. We either do that through hardware technology that we put out on the actual well itself, so often referred to as edge technology, or we'll actually go in and integrate into whatever data system is the central repository for all the data that an organization will look at from their well's perspective. Quite often that's a SCADA system. And so we will go into either via our edge hardware or via a SCADA system with the customer and start to collate all the data that they have relative to that well. And from that data, we will then start to understand and build a baseline of the performance of that well. And we do all sorts of great work in what we call a data refinery to take raw data, static, structured and unstructured data, and really start to organize that and then contextualize that data so that we're able to actually start to feed machine learning based algorithm. And so what we do is we baseline with customers the performance of those wells, the data that we have, and we really try to understand things like their operating procedures, their sort of philosophy and the physics that they've applied. And physics is a whole area that I won't get into. We've got a head of data science, our chief data scientist, that we best positioned to walk you through that. But really, what we're doing on the physics side is we have actually come out with proprietary physics methods that we use that are much more modern compared to some of the aged physics that's been used out there in the marketplace. And so, anyway, you net all that out is then you actually start to create this living algorithm that then drives recommendations of how to optimize that well. We then provide those recommendations through a software platform to the customer. The customer can then log in and they can see these recommendations on the well. And what happens is those recommendations, when you think about large scale customers across a large asset, those recommendations are coming thick and fast. And eventually customers say, hey, these recommendations are driving the kind of value improvements we're looking for. I feel confident they're inside of sort of our philosophy and how we want to drive the overall performance of our wells. And then what they can actually do is then automate that by saying, hey, we trust those recommendations, and those recommendations then get written totally back to the actual well, and then it's a closed loop automation process. And the reason customers are looking at this is, the industry has been through some turbulence. It's always required to run lean, but now more than ever before. And so we've got lots of folks out there trying to do a terrific job of optimizing and maximizing the investments that are made into these wells, and they just can't keep up. And they're not able to look at every well every day. And so really it's a support to them to ensure that they're able to keep up with the level of complexity and the demands of the job and able to optimize the wells as best they can.
It sounds like quite an elegant solution. I can only imagine there must be a multitude of benefits associated with that. Can you maybe walk me through one step deeper, if that's all right, how the recommendations for actions that drive better value, how does that translate into benefits, and what are some of those benefits that you see?
Yeah, quite simply, if I put it into three buckets, the benefits are, number one, are you driving performance above a decline curve? And so a well naturally goes through varying stages, from a free-flowing well to multiple artificial lift systems to eventually being a shut-in well. And so, a company, these companies aren't new at this, will traditionally have their sort of aggregate decline curve and say, how do we look at those set of wells, either by a field or an asset or company-wide, and say, what's the typical decline curve we would expect? And then are we able to demonstrate that we're able to keep them above the decline curve? So the net gain to the customer is we see a production uplift, and sometimes that uplift is, we just want to be careful. Maybe it's not an actual uplift off, where they were, but it's an uplift against their decline curve or perceived or projected decline curve. So in the case of the customers, that's positive return on investment, so they see a revenue improvement. So that's sort of one third of the conversation. The second third then is, when those wells either need to be turned off, shut in, closed down, turned around. There's a lot of cost associated with that. And so the more predictive and the more proactive you can be around the management of that well, it just gives so much more benefit on the cost management side of the operations. And so that's a significant component. And then the third component, which I touched on earlier, really is driven around how are you optimizing that well, and therefore what's the environmental impact you're having in that well. And so for us right now, if you look at two different lift types that we've worked on, both rod lift and plunger lift, we've been in a situation where we can demonstrate over a certain sample size of wells that we can have a material impact on GHG emissions through the reduction of electricity consumption in the case of rod lift wells, or the reduction in gas venting events in the case of plunger lift wells. And these numbers are not insignificant. And as you can appreciate, the E&P space is looking for opportunities to win, not just optically, but to actually win in reducing their GHG impact at a per well level.
Well, so thanks very much for that. And that's a really good lead into another question I wanted to ask around, and that's a sense of scale. Really, when you talk about the greenhouse gas benefits and I guess all the benefits that you talked about, how big is the opportunity for this solution across, for example, the province of Alberta? And do you have any rough quantities around how much greenhouse gas emissions could be reduced if you were wildly successful in the marketplace?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just give you the data that we do have that actually has been audited and approved. If you look at, if you took 1,000 rod lift wells, based on our performance to date, and these are audited results, we can demonstrate an 18,000 tons of CO2e per year impact in terms of GHG reduction. On the plunger lift side, if you took 1,000 plunger lift wells, we can demonstrate 103,000 tons of CO2e GHG emission reduction per annum. And so then you only got to look at the Alberta marketplace and size out the volume of wells that are operating in Alberta today. And the good news is given commodity price and everything else, I know Canada still maintains a position of let's not go crazy like we have in the past and jump on high drill demands, etc. But we are seeing a sustained increase in the efforts in the field, and therefore these numbers are very compelling once you start to scale up at an individual customer. Then you go across multiple customers, and then you go across an industry or a geography.
Carbon Copy is brought to you by Emissions Reduction Alberta. ERA takes action on climate change and supports economic growth by investing in clean technology solutions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, lower costs, attract investment, and create jobs here in Alberta. These investments help innovators develop and demonstrate technology that can lower emissions at home and be exported all over the world. That's why we've committed almost $800 million to 220 projects worth a total of $6.5 billion. To learn more, visit eralberta.ca.
So there's a tremendous opportunity for environmental benefits, particularly we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions reductions. What about economic benefits?
There's a significant data challenge that these large organizations are facing. We're working with a Canadian firm right now, and they are in a situation where through the acquisitions and mergers they've done, they're operating on 13 different SCADA systems in order to run their organization. And so they know that they can't live in 13 disparate worlds, but they're not going to get to one overnight. They can't afford to, for one, because they've got a business to run. And number two is practically, over the next couple of years, I'm sure they'd like to rationalize maybe down to 4 or 3 SCADA systems. What Ambyint's able to do is take all these disparate sources of information, legacy and new platforms and systems, and centralize that data, and then enrichen that data through contextualization, so then that data can be actually put into actionable outcomes. And that has had a huge significant impact on our customers. And so once they get through and we've got cases across many different customers, but every customer's circumstance is slightly different. But we see production uplift as much as 9% for customers. And when you start to put that into economic terms, that's very strong. We see significant impact on operating costs, as much as 30 to 40%. But really, where it gets really rich for customers is once they get through the sort of the economics and those, it's the operational impact that we're able to have and really set them up for sustainable long-term growth in a lean fashion. And that's really where the power of the story comes alive. So I try and get out of the glitz and the glamour of what's the big numbers you can drive for customers, and really more that organic, we can truly help them become set up sustainably for long-term growth.
Well, and I think we know there are lots of oil and gas wells across the province of Alberta. And you talked about targeting the conventional oil and gas production wells. What about, for example, heavy oil wells or oil sands wells or even other industries? Are there opportunities beyond the conventional oil and gas market for your team?
Oh, 100%. And so one of the things, I'm happy to talk transparently, 2020 was a really rough year. If you think about the impact that would have had on many of your listeners today, we weren't any different. So 2020 was definitely a setback year for our company. We actually achieved quite a lot in terms of technology deployments that we've been working on for quite some time. But, naturally, performance wasn't great that year. And so, we really are sort of getting through that hangover. We're pleased to say we are through it now. So we are definitely looking to the future, and the future for us is really strong. We've got this, we've got the standard offering that we are continuing to refine and scale and get market penetration with and growth with, which is great. So that's really good, and you need a stable foundation in which to build the house from. We have that. But in order to go do all that, we did a significant lift. The technology team here, the innovation team, the R&D team that we've had have done a wonderful job of really pushing the envelope on what the power of the possible was in this space. And so in doing that, they've created all this IP around how to go about taking problematic situations, typically physics-influenced situations, and streamlining those in a way that you can deliver at relatively low cost automation at scale. And so in order to do that, we will not maintain in one industry per se. And so our growth trajectory is really focused on us broadening out, not just from the E&P sector, but out in the energy sector as an overall, and then into a larger industrial control sector. And so in 2022, our focus area will be moving into wind. And I'm happy to kind of give you the rationale and the strategy around that. But to your point, because there's such a rich ingredient that we've created, now there's other recipes we can go and make. And 2022, given that we're through the hangover of 2020, we've had a really positive year in 2021. So we're feeling bullish again at Ambyint. And so as we go into 2022, the wind is a target market for us to be focused in on.
Well, that sounds very exciting. So let me take a step back. You used the term artificial intelligence, and I've been hearing that a lot lately. Can you tell me, sort of plain language, what in the world is artificial intelligence, and how is that different from non-artificial intelligence or simply intelligence?
Yeah, and our data scientist, chief data scientist, Ferdy Hingeland, would be in a much better position to walk you through that, but because he leads that practice area. From our perspective, the way that we look at it is we're really taking contextualized data, we're applying good mathematic principles to create algorithms that are repeatable and scalable, and then we're playing those back to customers for them to implement into their production process so that they can optimize, in the case of our current footprint, oil and gas, conventional oil and gas, but in the wind space it would be no different. And so it's not this sort of huge black box that people think it is. It's not, sometimes there's a misconception about AI. It's not sort of taking over the human process, but what it's doing is it's giving tons of computing power and logic to a situation where the data has been refined, so it's contextualized, and it's bringing all those together and then being able to apply those. And the way that we've done it at Ambyint is we've really worked with customers to make sure that they understand the value of it. Because for a lot of people, they're like, oh, AI, that sounds like, a bit scary, a bit out there. Maybe it's going to, replace my job, etc. But what we found working with folks specializing in optimization in the field is once they actually get to know the platform and once they get to trust and understand it and realize that it's really thinking the way they're thinking, but it's just allowing them to do it at much more scale with much more science behind it, then they go, wow, it's kind of really helping me make quicker decisions in a much more expressive fashion. And so, I don't want to get into sort of the debate around AI because there's lots of different methodologies and approaches to AI and data science. But for us, that's the sort of the principles we built our AI capability on. Simple, it's simplified for the customer, but there's a lot of complexity that goes in behind it. And so at Ambyint, when we set out our sort of approach in the market, we talked about three distinct things that we felt differentiated us in this AI journey, and it was really the combination of the physics, the subject matter expertise. So we have folks that have spent time in the field in the areas of which we're recommending our AI solutions to, and then the actual AI engine we've created. And it's the combination of those three that come together to create the outcomes that we drive for customers.
So at what point do these systems become self-aware and wage war against the human race?
Great question. I don't think they do, but that's just my position. If you think about how we go through a customer experience, so when we join up with a customer, we do demonstrations, we get them to understand the software, the platform, the team that support it, and at some point they say, okay, let's go for it. And then there's this sort of, because of the understanding they have, they think you flick on a switch, you do some plug and play and then you flick on a switch and all of a sudden it just happens. Absolutely not. What we do is we work, as I explained earlier, what we do is we work around the customer's philosophy. And so if, for example, someone that's been in engineering has been doing wells a certain way for 10 years isn't overnight going to say, well, I'm just going to do it differently. And so we seek to understand. So there's a ton of human input into this process. And I think that's the thing that people almost sort of assume, that for an AI engine to work, you just flick it on and away you go. But in something as complex as this, you need that input because they'll have knowledge of wells that you couldn't possibly have unless you spent time in the field or time in their asset and you've understood the conditions, the parameters in which they're working in. And so when we start with customers, that a lot of humans giving input into the actual logic that we're building before we even switch it over. And then this take over the world concept, our approach is we actually play back these recommendations to customers. Because ultimately what comes out is it says, here's a recommendation of how you should manage that well. That usually comes in a series of set points or recommendations around, how you perform with the well. And so from that perspective, what we do is we provide those recommendations. So they come through on a software platform. You can review them and you say, yeah, I like it. I dislike it. I've got questions about it. And then they go, okay. And so then they work with the team around those. But what we found is customers have said, look, you're working on so many wells. We're getting so many recommendations. We like what we see. Can you just send them straight through? And so they have the ability on a well-by-well basis in our platform to go in and actually click automate that well and just auto recommend and get them sent through, or they can choose not to send them through if they feel like that's a well that's having some challenges or they still want to understand our philosophy more. Remember, it's not one person looking at all wells for a company, so you may have a diverse group of people with a different appreciation for how they want to run their wells. And so you've got to bring them on that journey. For you to really get automation at scale, it's a change management situation.
Well, it sounds like you're having great success so far. So let's talk about the project. I understand you've just completed a project in partnership with ERA, Emissions Reduction Alberta. Can you tell me a little bit more about the project, what it entailed, what you hoped to achieve at the outset of the project?
So we started in a relationship where really the goal was to work with ERA in partnership to really figure out what's the state of the market, what's the state of the possible, and how much value could we drive through innovative and creative thinking and putting those ideas into practice. And so the relationship was one of working in partnership to truly push the envelope to see how far we could go. And the assessment from our side was it was a very strong relationship. We felt like we could really drive the kind of outcomes that ERA would be looking for. We were able to work with them to stabilize on a few of our concepts around how we would capture greenhouse gases and the impact that we would have. And overall, it was an education for us around how to look at this much more critically than we had been in the past. And I think it was a win for ERA in the sense that they got to see how a high-tech firm like ourselves was able to drive not only a commercial reality, but also an ESG reality that actually had an impact on emissions reduction.
Yeah, thanks for that. And so you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I want to ask a little bit more. I understand that at least one point in the project, your team needed to pivot or change directions in the project, or at least focus your efforts more on one thing and less on another. I wonder if you can tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, when you're innovating, you can't do that in a vacuum, right? You've got to be out there in the market and testing for feedback. Voice of the customer, voice of the market, voice of the employee, voice of the process have all been critical. And so Ambyint's had to be agile and adaptable through the process. And so in partnership with ERA, we were able to do that as well, which is great. One of the big things we found is when we sort of went to market, we had a hardware offering bound with some software and some services that eventually landed in the form of a platform that the customer could use. That was our approach, that was our strategy, and it's sound. But what we found is as customers really started to enjoy the benefits of our solution, they were saying, look, we need to scale up. And, some of these wells are on a significant decline curve. So optically, I'm not looking to spend a significant amount of dollars on hardware to be attached out in the field. I'd much rather just have a software platform. And so we had to pivot in the sense that whilst we were working with the ERA, we were getting this customer feedback that we needed to move into much more of a hybrid offering around our deployment of our solution. And so during the time with the ERA, we had to pivot in that regard and actually move to a software-only offering alongside a full turnkey offering. And whilst I said earlier 2020 was a tough year, we were able to do that. And so now we actually have both of those offerings commercially available in the market. We didn't have that before. And so that was a major pivot in the organization to do that, because we were sort of on one track, and based on market feedback and our need to adapt, we provided that as additional. And so what we find, in fact, is with some customers, that if they're looking to essentially take on a significant project with us, they may start on a smaller scale where they do actually put a hardware or software or platform in place, because ultimately that's the fastest path to see the platform in their environment. And then what they do is they go, okay, really like the results we got from that. Now we're prepared to invest in all that wonderful system integration and data integration work that would need to go on for us to not have a hardware device at every well in the field when they're up to 3,000 or 4,000 wells. And then they actually go through a software-only deployment. But in order to kind of get a feel for the platform in their environment, they will start out with a full turnkey solution to come in.
Yeah, I think that speaks to the importance of being nimble and responsive. So thanks very much for that. You talked about a couple things in terms of future opportunities. I did want to ask maybe a little bit within the context of the conventional oil and gas industry, how deep and widespread do you see this solution being adopted across the industry, and what are the next steps for you in order to try and achieve that market adoption widespread across the province and elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I will say this, and for your listeners, hopefully they humor me. I've been in Calgary since 2004, so when you live and work in the Calgary marketplace, you get a sense of the market, even if you're not in it every day. I mean, I work for large tech firms, then I work for small entrepreneurial firms, and I've landed at Ambyint, where I'm trying to bring those two worlds together. But all of it has been heavily tied to the energy sector. And my significant other, she worked for some of the significant names in the industry around the O&G space. And so what's interesting is leading edge technology is it comes with its merits and its concerns. And so, if you'd have talked to Ambyint 2 or 3 years ago, this idea that they built this really, really tremendous engine that could create these kind of outcomes was very much packaged as this, leading edge AI. And just to be clear, AI has been a very interesting, almost, attractive term in the investor community and everything else. So there's a whole ball of wax that goes with that. But in doing so, there's also this sense of, is it just a buzz? Is it a hype? And all those other things. And so what we found in the EMP space is they want to see, they really don't want to be sold to by the company. They want to be sold to by their peers, right? These guys talk, it's a close-knit community. They talk a lot about what works, what doesn't. And so we're at that stage where we've had lots of people show an interest, but now we've really started to get those commercially flowing relationships where we want them. Because it's one thing for a company to say, hey, we'll give it a try and see if it works. And they try it and they move on, and they don't really take that next step in terms of scale. But now what we've seen is, just in the last 12 months, this has been a real spurt for us, is a lot of those customers that were sort of showing an interest, they felt like it was a bit early for them, but they still wanted to show an interest, have really got past that sort of that taste of value, and now are in that full sort of commercial flight with us. And so what's really exciting about that is that's pushing the envelope internally to say, well, now we got this platform, we really like it. Now we can give you some really rich input on features and format and all these other things that we like. So we're spending lots of time working with customers on simple things, on the way it looks and feels for their environment, because they're used to dealing with a myriad of systems, and adding more systems in the mix can sometimes be just one extra headache. So we're working with things like visualization and the user experience around that, and that's been really rewarding. But the other thing is now we've got customers referring us to other customers, and I think that's really significant. The other thing is we've shifted a little bit in the way that we're going about it. So I'm a big fan of sort of working with the ecosystems that already exist. And so when you're working with customers, they'll have trusted organizations they work with, they have their partners, they have the suppliers. And sometimes if you're a new entrant into their world, that can feel a bit less known, and therefore the speed to get to the value is slower. And so we're doing much more work around ecosystem selling. And so what do I mean by that? We're actually in conversations with a firm right now that wants to take our offering and represent it as a larger offering into the market in a very defined way, and almost a bit faceless to the customer. So, they have the relationship, they already existing customers, they want to bring this incremental value. So as long as they've got the trust, then we will be able to integrate into their current platform and provide that as an additional module to what they're being offered. And so that's a different sort of go-to-market approach than we've had in the past. It's an augment, it's not a shift, it's just a difference. So that's sort of bucket number one. And then bucket number two, as I touched on earlier, is we're very excited about the pivot that we think we can make into the wind market. And it's something we've thought about for quite some time. 2020 set us back a little bit, but we do see that we're going to have the ability to move into wind in 2022. And we're really excited and feel like that's really going to open up economic opportunity for us, and also scalable impact in the marketplace, both here in the Canadian market, but also in the US and international market as well.
Sounds very promising on both fronts, I would say. And I'd love to touch base with you again in 2022, maybe a year from now, and find out how things are going.
Absolutely.
Is there anything I didn't ask you about that you think our audience would really want to know about Ambyint?
Well, there's a couple of things. So due to the ERA relationship, we originally were going after sort of the economic impact that we could have for our customers. And then in partnership with ERA, we've really seen the ESG impact we can have for our customers. And so we're really excited. So next month, we're actually going live with our formal ESG program at Ambyint. So Ferdinand, that I mentioned on the call earlier, our chief data scientist, he's actually going to be our ESG ambassador. And so that's really a key sort of shift in terms of the way we're going to communicate around our overall value. And so this program is really, it's very much leading with ESG principles. So the desire of the program is to help, our employees, our customers, our stakeholders, the industry, partners and the communities in which we serve, collectively, make our ESG efforts stronger. Practically, we've established an ESG framework, a set of reporting tools that will help raise awareness, but also capture the impacts that this program is having. We're actually working in partnership with the University of Calgary to secure our first ESG intern. We've got formal internal training on our ESG program, but also external best practice sharing that we're doing. We've got a content series we're launching next month, which will be a series of vignettes around our program, but also our thoughts around how companies can get really practical in their ESG efforts. And then for our existing customers, that comes in the form of a standardized set of KPIs and reporting, which can directly feed into whatever ESG reporting governance and controls they have in their organization. And so, and that wouldn't happen without sort of the project that we took under with ERA. And so we're really pleased to be launching that next month.
Well, thank you very much, Benjamin. It's been wonderful talking to you today, and I appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thanks for the time.